I'm attorney Zulu Ali, and I have the Justice Watch crew with me, Rosa Nunez and Michael Clark. This week, like we do every Sunday, we'll talk about important and critical legal issues affecting our community. Our guest today is Dr. Akil Bashir. Dr. Bashir is founder and CEO of Professional Community Intervention Training Institute, which is the first certified 18-week community violence intercession gang intervention institute. Mr. Bashir has been described as one of the nation's most premier public safety crisis intercession, violence elimination professionals in society today. Being one of the most respected, sought-after certified hands-on practitioners and instructors in this field, Dr. Bashir teaches, instructs, and consults with educational entities, gang intervention teams, private industry, select law enforcement personnel, emergency responders, and a host of others in understanding and interaction with gangs and other issues regarding crisis intervention. Dr. Bashir also has a doctorate degree from the Chicago School of Psychology. So I want to thank Dr. Bashir for being with us today.
Well, I'm honored to be here.
Okay. So today we'll be discussing the recent killing of Stephon Clark by police in Sacramento last month. We'll also discuss the use of deadly force in our communities, crisis or justification. And just for those of you who do not or may not be aware of the issue regarding Mr. Stephon Clark and his violent and brutal death that happened earlier on March the 18th, 2018, last month, police officers responded to a call of car break-ins at Meadowview neighborhood in Sacramento, California. That night, Stephon Clark, who was unarmed, and he was a 22-year-old father of two, was struck 8 times in his grandmother's backyard. And according to news sources, the county sheriff's department helicopter joined the search and hovered above, at one point telling officers that a suspect had picked up a crowbar. The officers eventually spotted Mr. Clark, who appears to have run from them into his grandmother's backyard. The body camera video and the officers heard shouting the word gun repeatedly and opening fire almost immediately. So no weapon was found on Mr. Clark's body, and the only object that was found was his cell phone. So, Dr. Bashir, I wanted to see if I could get you to give us your general analysis of what happened in that particular case.
Sure. That, as well as the hundreds, if not thousands, of other cases that we see on an ongoing basis throughout this country, the facts speak for themselves. It's really not the circumstances of what transpired. At the end of the day, it's the conclusion of what happened, which was another life lost. And why was that life lost? Was it based on dysfunctional policies? Was it based on the perception of the officers? What was it actually based on? Until we actually understand that we have to look at the process that these officers make their split-second decisions at the end of the day and what constitutes that, we're going to continue to see these type of deaths occur throughout the country, Brother Ali.
Okay. So I know that basically, and again, I'm not quite sure, and I don't know whether it was, I'm assuming it was city police officers that were involved in the shooting, and obviously we don't have any indication as to what their use of force policies may have been. But I know that basically the purpose of having a use of force policy, especially initially one of the objectives, is to make sure that it builds some sort of trust in keeping civilians safe. I mean, so it seems like based upon what has been happening in our communities, for a very long period of time, is that these policies, whether they're following the policies, I'm not quite sure, but it does seem that basically the whole idea of keeping civilians safe isn't something that seems to be the focal point of these policies.
Well, when you look at a policy, it's an old saying, if you don't like the output, you got to change the input. And if the policies are not achieving the goals that they were structured to do, they need to be revised. Now, when you look at a policy is predicated on certain modes of operandi, certain skill sets, and this is training. We always hear officers need more training, et cetera. Well, yes, that's true, they need more training, but we don't need operational training because the policies that continue to be put in place are not being followed. What we need is psychological training. We need to understand the perception that these officers have embraced in terms of dealing with individuals of color in their community. When you look at a situation of a perception perception, and the perception is reality to the individual, whoever that perception is. The perception is had, and then from the perception, what you'll get is evaluational process. What you'll get is a person thinking that from that perception, I'm going to put my value system in place. Now, if my value system in place, which is the indicative of rights and wrong, if that value system in place is not inherently coming from me, if it's coming from an operational structure, in this case a police department, that is what I'm going to follow, and that is going to set my principles. If that becomes the principles, and if I, as a police officer, am constantly being told that these communities of color are adversarial, these communities, we have to arm you from a military standpoint, we've got to get you thinking from a military standpoint, ultimately there's going to be an adversary that I'm going to look to that is going to be my enemy that I'm going to want to destroy. So that becomes my thinking process. And when you think about an adversary is one that you either control, terminate, or eradicate.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that when you talk about the mindset of a police officer, I know that a police officer can only use deadly force under two situations. One is to protect the life of themselves or the life of another innocent party, and the other one is basically what it had actually been known as the fleeing felon
Right.
principle, where someone
Right.
there's a probable cause to believe that a fleeing felon may pose a danger to someone else. So what's happening, of course, in the when these officers are analyzed, they're supposed to be, when it talks about what is reasonable, it has to be objectively reasonable from an objective
Yes.
officer's perspective. And I think that when you talk about an objective officer's perspective, then what does matter, or what has come into play, is what would an objective officer think in a particular situation. I know in this particular case where you're talking about Mr. Clark, who apparently allegedly had been involved in a minor crime, I would imagine. I'm assuming that we haven't heard anything other than potentially some sort of vandalism. Potentially, we don't know that for sure, but at least that's what I've heard.
Correct.
Now, assuming that you're chasing someone who is actually involved in some sort of vandalism type of crime, then obviously, and he's fleeing from you, then there was no reason to believe, based upon that analysis, that he had a gun.
Well, fleeing is the key word. Going away from the threat.
Right.
See, in order for it to be an imminent threat, it has to be a threat that is normally coming towards you. So number one, we have to analyze, okay, was he going? And from the number of shots and where they were placed throughout the body, he was not in the advancing mode. Number two, the officers never identified themselves. So when you are thinking about the culture, back to perception of a person of color in a community that is dark, and you hear people coming at you, you hear people calling your name, but they don't identify, even if he knew they were police officers, the threat, the perception is that the possibility of me losing my life in my engagement with these police officers is extremely high based on past situations. So his response to that was to probably try to run defensively and get some type of cover. I can't speak for the man, unfortunately, his past, but the perception is that his life was in danger to him. And if we look at the normality of people of color in these communities and their relationship with police officers, that would be probably the normal thinking of 75 to 80% of the people of color, especially being a young black man between the age of 16 and 25 years of age.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. I mean, because we've seen so much of what's happening in the community and these continuous issues regarding and the problem, of course, is that we cannot really have a serious dialogue because, unfortunately, we tend to have a community where if you want to talk about the issues, you're either anti-police or pro-police, and you kind of, unfortunately, because we've been conditioned to only have one particular type of viewpoint, that it creates a problem with discussing and having a dialogue about the issue.
100% correct. I've trained over 1,300 LAPD and law enforcement officers throughout the country. The first thing we do when we're sitting down with them, we establish a perspective of equality. They know we're coming on equal terms. We're not coming from a subservient position. We're not coming from a position of inferiority in terms of that relationship. And unfortunately, that's what officers are used to. Now, I do need to say this. You know, the diametric opposing construct here is, yes, the use of force, and use of force based on the average normal police officer, or as you so excellently alluded to. But then the counterbalance is shoot to kill.
Mm-hmm. Right.
See, that's a diametric opposing opposite. Why is the first rule of law in an engagement, if you shoot to kill? You know, I'm a firearms expert. I understand the concept of pulling a gun, and if you pull that gun, you shoot to kill. But at the end of the day, when the right to take a person's life is based on your perception, the higher standard is on you as a police officer to make sure that you have went through a total process of evaluation and have done everything possible to make sure you don't have to terminate that life. The termination of life should be the last resort, not the first resort.
Yeah. And that's kind of the thing when you see all of these cases. I mean, of course, we've got, you know, hundreds of cases where there's an allegation that the officer's life was in danger. However, there was no, you know, guns was not found in the incident. They thought that their life was in danger, but ultimately that wasn't the case. After you find out after the fact that the individual life has been terminated based upon some sort of perception that they call that is objectively reasonable. So I think that obviously the issue right now and really the solution, and of course we'll talk about that a little bit more, is obviously the whole issue of accountability. And really what is happening is that basically the number of officers who are prosecuted regarding you know, these shootings, the conviction rate is extremely low. I mean, much lower than it is for the average citizen. Also, the precursor to that is when you begin to start talking about the ability of a law enforcement agency to, you know, to police up its own ranks. And obviously, you know, I think that no agency should be involved in any of its to do its own investigation, because there's a conflict of interest there. Because
Yes,
obviously the agency is ultimately going to be liable for any officer who is found responsible for an unlawful killing. And not only the agency itself, the city, as well as even oftentimes, you know, lack of supervision. So, I mean, what is your take on the issue of this inherent conflict when it comes to policing up their own ranks?
I think it's a definite cancer. Let me be real clear to the listening public and all involved. There are some outstanding police officers out there. You have to look at the individual perception of the officers. The issue is the process. See, the process and the systematic structure in which they operate from. Like I said, when we hear about training, it's a constant reference to operational protocol being established, how skill sets are developed, how protocol is developed, when we need to be looking at the behavioral perspective in terms of what they're being taught. Something is wrong inherently with the structure in which they operate from. And to specifically go to your question in terms of them policing themselves, that's ludicrous. We have seen historically, time and time again, when they police themselves, we get the same outcome at the end of the day. When we look at the societal perspective, and society plays a large role in this, because if I establish my belief system based on those perceptions at the end of the day, my belief system either changes or stays the same based on the consequences of that system. If I have no consequences of that belief system, I am going to reinforce the fact that that my belief system is okay. So from that, what happens is there's no need for me to psychologically change the construct. I'm going to keep doing exactly what I'm doing because from my perspective, it's okay. From the societal perspective, it's okay. When the courts tell me continuously that there is no issue for what I'm doing in terms of how I operate, then I got a threefold trinexus, which tells me that I'm doing the right thing the right way. We wonder why we keep going back to the same dynamic of this same picture occurring year after year, decade after decade. This has been occurring since the 1950s, and we haven't been able to solve it. That is because infrastructurally, operationally, the process has not changed.
And that kind of, has always been an issue with regards to power. Power in and of itself. I mean, we've known through history that man has always had, messes up power. And unfortunately, if you don't have the proper mechanisms in place to check people when they abuse those powers, because I mean, there's a strong hypocrisy to the manner in which police officers are treated, and a manner in which the average citizen is being treated. And obviously, if a average citizen is being held to a higher standard than even a police officer, then basically what you're doing is that he's just going to abuse the power. I mean, it's just part of human nature, unfortunately. We've seen that time and time again. And one of the things that I believe is significant is I think that until we begin to start putting mechanisms in place to check these officers, then nothing is going to actually change. And
Yes.
like you said, I mean, every officer clearly is not a bad officer. That's not. But you cannot change the. There's no room for change. So what happens is when you're trying to dialogue in order to make that change, they change the narrative, and they change the narrative by accusing you of being anti-police.
Yes.
And so, I'm of the position that, and we've had this discussion before. I remember where there was a situation in Texas where an officer was violently killed innocently. And, our outrage was just as intense, and we had, one of our workshops right after that happened, and we were just as enraged by the fact that this officer was violently killed. And so it seems that, it's hard to understand how when we dialogue, we would have the same show. If an officer was violently killed innocently, we would be just as outraged.
Yes.
As we would if some civilian was killed innocently. And I don't understand how that continues to be an issue where we can't have that dialogue because people don't value the lives of certain people the same way they value the lives of others.
That was well said, Brother Ali. Look, when you stand for justice, you stand for justice across the board. You don't get to pick and choose who that justice that you will put in place should be significant of. So if you see a person of color, non-color, if you see a person being treated from a perspective of a lack of equality, I can go on and on and on. If you are a true stander for justice, you're going to stand up across the board for that person. Now, people have a tendency when they don't understand, they become very defensive. And I think that's what police departments have done traditionally because they don't understand the outrage of the marginalized communities that are feeling like they're being terrorized by the police department. The police departments see it in their definition as a suppressive force. We've got to realize police departments are, in their mode of operandi, is suppression. That is their tactic. And so when you're suppressing, you have to be fair in that process of suppression. We all know that there is a moral need and a structural need for law. But that law has to be a fair law, that those people that are being having that law implemented on them feel like at the end of the day, they have a fair process of inclusion in what that law dictates. Marginalized communities don't feel that the process is fair. So then when they see the police officers who are enforcing an unfair process, the police officers become a double target in terms of their standard because it's a double whammy for those in communities of color. And then there's a normal resistance. So the hesitation and the defensiveness by the people in these marginalized communities is based on the fact that they feel a process is not inclusive of them and is not being implemented for their concerns and for their needs. That's really what we're up against. Back to power, you mentioned something about power, which is very important. There's different types of power. And are we talking about a legitimate power, or are we talking about a very corrosive power? We have to look when we talk about the application of power. Power speaks to power, and this is the way power works. So if you're a subservient to those that are bringing the power and you can't answer that power is going to consume you to a large degree. That's how power works. But power respects an equal degree of power, and unfortunately, most people in marginalized communities, communities of color, even some white communities, don't have that same catalyst of equation to match. So it becomes an imbalanced process of unjust enforcement.
Right, right. And one of the other issues is that one of the things that, we've been involved in is the whole issue of the jury reform. And for me, I believe that one of the things that the community should actually focus on as far as solution is concerned is that, we need to actually have a more diverse jury pool.
Definitely.
And I'm just saying
Definitely.
that from a perspective of not only when you're talking about individuals who are being accused of criminal acts, but also when you're talking about law enforcement officers as well. They need to be, the jury is the fact finder. When we talk about what is objectionably reasonable, then the jury who pool is the one. And so what is happening is when you start seeing these jury pools, and I was, myself as an attorney, I think that we've discussed, and I know that you in your experience testifying as an expert witness, and I know that our producers, we've had these discussions as well, is that you have a jury pool that does not look anything like the communities that they're serving. So when you have an individual in a community that is accused of committing a criminal act, it's not asking the jury to let someone go because they look like you, because in these communities are just as fearful of crime as anybody else. They're actually more fearful than anyone else. However, they want to make sure that the proper checks and balances are in place. And what I don't understand is how you can go to a trial and the jury pool is not reflective of the community. You can go.
Yes.
That definitely has to change. And if you have a more diverse jury pool, then officers who were charged with these criminal acts are going to be held to answer properly, and they're going to have a diverse and truly objectionable and fair and impartial jury. And the same thing would be for people who are accused of crime. You're going to see a lower number of people who are being prosecuted unlawfully, and more officers who are clearly going to probably be prosecuted more often if you have a more diverse jury pool.
Well, let's break that down, okay? Because what you said is spot on. Look, let's take the average white person in their relationship to police officers. The average white person has a constructive relationship for the most part. Police treat them differently. So their perception is going to be totally different from your engagement or my engagement as a Latino, as a black person, et cetera, because we have a different engagement with them. Now, when you look at the normality, see, this is what people don't understand. When you're going to try to analyze a situation, you got to look at a person's normality. What is their normal context of their operating sphere? What are they seeing in a process? What are they engaging with? What is their interaction? And if I can't understand your normality, I can never get to the essence of your thinking process, therefore never understanding what your perception is of that actual engagement. So if I can't understand your normality, I am going to operate from my normality. If my normality has been a positive, constructive relationship, I am not going to be able to see how yours was diametrically in opposite of mine. So I'm going to lean in favor of the actual police officers because I can relate to that mode of operandi, and I cannot even envision your mode.
Right.
This is no rocket science. When we really stop and think about what is going on in the narrative that is on board, it is imperative that jury structure has to represent at least a fair representation of, when we stop and think about it, not the individual, but the normality in which that individual thinks from.
Exactly. That's so true. I mean, and it's the same way with when you talk about. I don't know if people know this, but whenever a police officer testifies in a trial, it is actually a misconduct for a jury to assume that to evaluate an officer's testimony differently than they evaluate anybody else's testimony.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, if someone during jury selection tells the judge that I believe an officer before more than I believe anybody else, then obviously there's constitutional grounds to exclude that individual. So clearly, if you have an officer who's testifying who has one perspective and a jury who has a certain perspective of how they actually see police officers, then, you know, they're going to just automatically assume that the officer's telling the truth, right? And that's unfair, especially oftentimes when there's witnesses that oftentimes have testimony that may conflict with this officer, or you're supposed to presume the individual to be innocent. And what is amazing to me, and I mean, like you, Doc, I've been in the game for quite some time as a police officer myself and as a criminal defense attorney. I've never met a person accused of a crime that would ever say, I should be assumed to be guilty. You know what I mean? Everybody, it's amazing how people change their perspective when they're accused of something. You know what I mean? So, and unless you understand, unless you have that type of empathy of understanding, and if I'm sitting in that seat, if I'm looking at this man and I presume him to be innocent, then the prosecutor has an uphill battle. But if you're looking at it from the other perspective and you're thinking he's automatically guilty, then you're not giving him a fair trial. You're not allowing it.
That's right.
And I think that when you have individuals, and I'm not really keen on this whole conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican. I'm not really a paradigm type of person. I mean, I think that's somebody who's been trained. I think if you're educated, you have to think for yourself.
That's right.
And so my thing is that basically when you're thinking about justice, there is no socioeconomic political paradigm that should interfere with the way that you're viewing, a criminal case.
That's right.
And I think until we make people truly understand, and people who are believe in our country, believe in our Constitution, and believe in the principles for which, we all believe in, then if you really believe in it, believe in it. You can't say that you are a true American and truly believe in American principles and not be outraged when a young, innocent man is killed unjustly and unlawfully. I just don't understand that whole ideology.
Well, I piggyback on that because, and let's be clear, it has been apparent that there has been a ravage of communities of color. We've died tragically at the hands of those who are supposed to be protectors, etc. Now, I want to go a little bit deeper here, Brother Ali, because regardless of what's brought to the table, until we change the psychological direction of a thinking process of an officer, we are going to be combating this problem for years to come. Why is that so important? When you look at the savage nature of these deaths and how they occur, let me tell you something. There has to be something psychologically which tells me in my mind that I have an inherent right to destroy to this degree. You can't do this type of damage and not feel any reserve in the process. So if the type of deaths that we see occurring on an ongoing basis, and those deaths are occurring so quickly, there has been inherent acceptance of the fact that I have ultimately the right. I don't know if it's a God-given right, a political right, or a job-oriented right, but the acceptance has already happened. And so you can bring anything on board. You can bring as many rules, as many laws, as many training methodologies, as many systems of accountability. But until that officer changed the fact that I do not have the right of this type of destruction. Yes, I have a right to enforce this law. I have a right to apprehend. I have a right to arrest. And at the end of the day, if this individual is trying to terminate my life or somebody else's life, I have the right to remove him so that threat will be lessened to the larger populace. But that is a lot that has to be understood, a lot that has to be engaged. And we're talking about all that's coming out when that officer makes that final decision for what he has to do. So my point is there has to be a process. There has to be a thinking process I'm going through at the end of the day. So if I reach that conclusion to take a life, I can sit back and say I am validated. I was validated by the circumstances, the behaviors, and the actions of the individual. And if I didn't terminate that that life, there was going to be more of a cancer that would have transpired, more of an explosion of that threat as opposed to not. So when I jump out of the car and almost in a matter of seconds, minutes, I take that life, obviously there has not been me going through that thinking process. Now, I in no way am going to try to think for every officer out there. They have some split-second decisions that they have to make. I understand that. Like I said, I train them. I'm a practitioner. I'm on the ground. I know what happens out there. But for the most part, there still has to be a check and balance of personal discipline that the officer has to take. And when that life is taking at the end of the day, they could feel justified across the board. But the way things are happening now, there is too much acceptance of the fact that I can terminate this life and I have the right to, and the consequential mechanism of accountability agrees with me having that right. And so because of that, I'm going to continue to do what I do. This is my process. I'm going to use that process. And lastly, look, I always say this as we relate to violence. When an individual uses violence, they feel that there's very few other options for them. Now, if I continue to use that violence, I get better at that violence. If that violence at the end of the day is giving me the results and the rewards that I want, guess what? I'm going to continue to use that violence and I'm going to refine that violence. And it seems like inherently that is what's going on with these police shootings, with the dogmatic engagement that some of the officers have, and just the overall mentality of what we see. Again, back to those good officers, we want to give you your props, but let's be real clear here. You have a system that is corrupt, that needs to be changed, that is dysfunctional, and is doing disservice to such a large populace of this societal structure that there has to be changes, and those good officers out there should be leading the charge for those changes to happen.
Right. That's true. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the thing. I mean, the thing about the culture of policing, I think the culture of policing being a paramilitary type of culture, it's really really difficult for officers to police up their own ranks, and primarily it's because it's like going into battle. You know, I mean,
yes.
They're brothers. You know, these are individuals that depend on each other for their lives, going home at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And so obviously, the relationship that you have with your fellow officers is oftentimes different than a relationship that you have with the public. And you'll find that a lot of officers who, and at least, you know, in my experience, many officers who basically ultimately even end up getting disciplined or even losing their jobs because of the fact that they had been involved in some sort of corruption or some sort of brutality, they have very, very positive praise from their fellow officers. You know what I mean? I mean, they might seem great among their fellow officers, and they might in their mind see it as being justified. But I think that, you know, the psychosis of a police officer and the things that he has to deal with on a daily basis, I think sometimes, I mean, it does, the same way that you see these guys who are coming back from battle and coming back from war, and I have a veterans legal clinic and I deal with veterans who suffer from PTSD. And oftentimes these officers who are coming back are actually ultimately coming right from the battlefield and right into police departments.
Yes.
And they've never had any of that stuff checked.
Yes.
And sometimes the same thing, it continues to happen to them. So, you know, I mean, there's a lot going on there, and I think that, you know, hopefully, you know, we get to a point where we can actually begin to start you know, dealing with these issues and actually making, you know, bringing people to the table, clear thinking people who are not doing it from a biased perspective and trying to get, you know, a way to deal with it. And I believe that the jury pool selection, I mean, we have to have some sort of really aggressive movement about making sure that in jury pools that we have a cross-section of our communities represented in these jury pools. That has to happen. And I know that we've had, you know, all of my producers and the people involved in our organizations, we've been talking about that.
Yeah. But that's putting the public back into public safety.
Mm-hmm.
has been missing for so long. And when you look at some of the things to add on to what you said, because I'm in total agreement, we've got to stop the embracement of the broken windows policy. That's where so much of this started, where the lower crime on the totem pole was gone after, as opposed to the larger crime. I think in addition to that, we're talking about fundamentally, we have got to stop militarizing these communities, because you breed just what you said, Ali, that soldier concept to where the community is an adversary. We have to have community representation on these broader police panels. They have to actually hear. You've got police boards that have no members from the citizenry on those panels, so they're getting a one-sided perception of how things are going on out there and what's happening. I think we have already talked about training. You have definitely have to watch officers and the body cams, but again, the body cams we're finding out, while in some cases they've proven to be a very good tool, but if I can basically, to a large part, do what I want to with that body cam, it defeats the purpose. Just like the situation that we just had, where that body cam was actually turned off when the dialogue was had. And I think community oversight. All police departments have to have a community oversight committee developed that can work with the police commission to look at, evaluate, and determine if the best policies are being in place. And lastly, from a municipality standpoint, the community, key people, key leadership that is validated from the community has to be in the process of policy development when the cities and when the counties develop what their police policies are going to actually be. At least they have to have a voice in terms of that normality being represented.
Right. We definitely have to get the community involved. And that's one way to do it a lot of times, is actually getting the community actually involved in the process. I believe that what happens is that sometimes the communities tend to, we've seen the protests, we've seen the outcry, we've seen the social media, we've seen all these things, but we're not seeing any changes. We've seen the town hall meetings, we've seen meeting with the police chiefs, we've seen community-oriented policing. We're seeing all these things, and those things aren't really working. And to me, I think that, from a firsthand perspective like ourselves, to being an expert witness in these cases and our discussions and your activism, we see that a lot of times it really boils down to a jury pool. And that seems like it's never the discussion. And what happens is when these communities have to go to these jury commissioners in their communities and make sure that when they call out a jury pool, that jury pool needs to be reflective of the communities in which these people live. And it's the same thing with police officers. If you're policing in this particular community, then the jury pool needs to be the people that you're policing. And that's how you're going to ultimately find, because until you're held accountable, I mean, it's unfortunately, that is just the nature of humans, that oftentimes when you're able to get away with something, you're going to get away with it. And some of these officers, they're kids. I mean, when I became a police officer, I was 22 years old. I was just out of the Marine Corps.
But they recruit. They go after 19 and 20-year-olds because this is a mindset that they know that they can form in the process. And it's the same thing with the military, same thing with the fire department. Most of your public safety entities want people that can follow a specific process, structure, infrastructure. So, that's inherent. They go after these officers. The other thing we've got to be very conscious of, they recruit a lot of these officers, and a lot of these officers request communities of colors to get their stripes. Let's call it like it is. They want to go into communities where there's a lot of action, so they can prove themselves and get this garnership of expertise under their belt, and that also has to be changed. The one thing I would say that we could do on a pro side for the police officers, and by no means, I will call out an officer, I will call out a department in a minute, as I have, but one of the things I think we have to do for those officers that we do find that are community vested, that are trying to do the right thing at the end of the day, we've got to make sure we can support those officers and use them as an example, as a counterbalance for these other officers. Because if they don't get the type of community support, guess what? They're going up against the big blue line of the department itself. So now they're in a quandrum. They're going against the police department because they're trying to do the right thing. The community's not giving them any support. So at the end of the day, they throw up their hands and say, well, hell, I might as well just pick me up a paycheck and do my job because, I can't win on either side. Right. So, and there are some community-based officers out there that do an excellent job. But at the end of the day, until we change the whole thinking process, until we change their operational process, until we identify and not be afraid to go after and remove those officers that are damaging, that are destructive, that are doing the type of unwarranted cancer in these communities, until we develop as a society and police community the nerve, the backbone, the tenacity, and the wherewithal to address that, then at the end of the day, we're going to be revisiting this thing every other day, every other week, every other year.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things that I was actually, thinking about as far as officers are concerned, I remember I had my supervisor who was a lieutenant. He told me that early in his career that basically it was more of the norm to become a police officer later in life. In other words, the latter part of your 20s as opposed to the younger part of your 20s. And I think that what happens is that whenever you do a background check on a 22-year-old who just got out of college, just got out of the military, there's very little there. Nobody, and sometimes these officers, they play out their problems in the department.
Yes.
And sometimes when that happens, obviously, if you're playing out your problems in your department, then, it's too late. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things is just making sure that, whenever we're evaluating officers to get in these departments, that they do a better selection process. But again, going back to what we talked about, making these officers accountable, that's just so important. And then when you talk about the statistics, and I think that we were reading about the statistics and what the statistics as far as the African American men or African Americans in general, the statistics between them being subjected to police shootings. Did you read on that?
Yeah. A big problem. I think that basically confirms everything that we've been saying. See, when you put a fact, a point out there, you always want to qualify that. And the facts in terms of who is getting shot qualify everything that we have said in this last hour. And no disrespect meant here, but look, we always talk about retraining in terms of protocol, but why is it that we never have to talk about and tell an officer he needs to be retrained when it comes to white people? Mm-hmm. It's only people of color that they need to be retrained. So that tells us it's a thinking process and not an operational process. Mm-hmm. Look, if my perception of a person of color is of a destructive nature, is of somebody that's going to do damage to me, is of somebody that doesn't deserve the degree of humanization, guess what? I'm going to feel, and it goes back to the part of the concept that I do have the right to destroy this individual. I'm going to feel my actions against this individual are warranted to some degree because guess what? I don't see them on the same level of value that I see myself. So I have a right to go in there because this person is an inherent risk to me and society. In the most part, a lot of times just based on my societal perception, what I've either seen in the news, what I've either heard on the radio, etc. Most of these younger officers, they don't even have enough damn life experience under their belt to have an evaluation to say what you and I, or at the end of the day, what their expectations should be in terms of their relationship with us. Most of these officers are babies. So many of these officers have not even gotten out of their own comfort zone. So that evaluational process is not even on board yet. Now, I will say this. When you talk about an officer, person of color, etc., again, if I don't have any balance or anything to balance that imagery of that officer with. If I have had very few experiences with people of color, even if I came in there with a negated mindset that I have a right to do this, if I could pull up psychologically somebody that was of color or that fit that marginalized mold that could give me a counterbalance to that person I'm seeing, I might be able to pull myself back and say that is not the total norm. But they're seeing so many in our communities as the total norm, and they're making a valued statement that everybody under this banner deserves this type of treatment, and I have the right to give it. It's happening too fast, and it's happening too much.
Right.
Do you look at it as like, I know when I was growing up, we had this gang banging type mentality, and if we went out and did something, we did it for status. You know, we saw when you took a life, you tattooed the little teardrop on your eye. When it comes to the officers, it seems as though they function in that same accord. They stick together with the code of silence, and I understand that there are some good cops, but how good can they be if they seeing all of this injustice going on and they still remain silent?
Yes, that's what I was alluding to when I said it's on the onus of the so-called good officer to step to those bad officers. And see, stepping to those officers, that takes some sacrifice. Stepping to those officers, I mean, you might have to go up against the entire system and you're going to get a target on your back. A lot of those officers, even though they feel in their heart want to step out and do the right thing, they fear the consequences of doing that right thing. So going back to your initial question, look, when you look at the gang culture, you look at the actions, the characteristics, and the common denominators in how a gang culture operates. I'm not going to label a person a gang member based on what he says or what somebody tells me. I'm going to watch what they do.
Exactly.
And then I'm going to interpret that in terms of they fit into this mold. The same thing with the officers. You know, you look at a fraternity. A lot of the fraternities have the same common denominators of a gang set. So if they're acting like gang members, if they're doing the actions of what a gang member does, if they're ending up using the same type of processes that a gang member use, you damn straight it's a gang culture, straight up.
And you know, I wanted to chime in also as well as as the jury, in regards to the jury that we talked about, you know, in the Stop and Frisk Academy several times. I think we have a great responsibility that when we are called, you know, that, you know, we don't make those excuses to get off the jury pool. In fact, we do what we can to sit on the jury pool. Now, the flip side of that is that the great majority of us that come from the African American community, our economic status is not up there. So we can't sit on a jury pool for no whole week and be able to suffice for our family. And I understand in those cases, we have to pull ourselves off. But then also, you know, one of the general questions that is asked during that time is, have you ever had police encounter? Now, what African American hasn't had any police encounter? And the thing about it is that is used as an excuse to excuse them from the jury. And so it's like you got a double-edged sword here. And, you know, there are some people who do try to get on jury, but the great majority of people, like, look, I got to go to work. I got a family to feed. You know, so, I mean, you know, where do we stand in that situation?
We got to have better advocacy. See, anything you do, and this is what I try to tell a lot of my young warriors and warriorettes who are out there in these movements. Okay, these are not movements, they're moments. A movement is sustained, in the long term. If you're going to be a part of the movement, there's collective sacrifice. If you're going to be a part of the movement, there's an infrastructure that has to be built that's going to determine how that movement moves. Part of any movement is having a strong advocacy arm. We have got to change policies and laws at the end of the day, and this is what you're referring to, this is what Brother Ali referred to so effectively. The process of the jury system is incorrect, and it's not a fair process that everybody benefits from. So at the end of the day, until they actually change the charter structure of how the jury process is implemented, we are up against a wall. We've got to stop operating on emotionalism and become far more strategic in our thinking and planning to make sure at the end of the day we can get long-term laws in place that are going to be beneficial to those communities that are adversely affected, that we have some ownership and control of at the end of the day, or at least have our voice in the process of how those laws are brought forth.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, it's kind of like, you want to. There's different. You get different feedback as far as how juries are chosen. Some they say is from the voter registration. Some you say is from the DMV, registration. I guess it just depends. But when you go to, I've been in Compton, which is clearly a predominantly African American and Hispanic city, where the entire jury pool there was not one African American and not any Hispanics. I've been to Inglewood, where there was not any African Americans and not any Hispanics on a jury pool. How does that happen? How is that absolutely possible for something like that to happen? And I'm not suggesting that someone who isn't of color cannot be fair and impartial. However, you need that wide perspective on the jury in order to do it. That's what we do. It's cross-cultural communications. I'm not going to assume I know your plight or I understand something unless I listen to you. And that's what we need to do. One of the things that we need to do in our schools is stop training people and start educating people and learning how to communicate cross-culturally and understand that we come from different perspectives,
But I think this is what gives them the go-ahead to do what they do. Is because they know what type of jury is made up, what the jury is made up of. So it's it gives me a green light to go ahead and do what I'm going to do because I'm going to be at the end of the day I'm going to be exonerated.
Right. Exactly. Or when they choose to prosecute people who should not be prosecuted because they know that you can go with a very bare minimum of evidence in front of certain jury pools and you're going to have a better chance. And like you said, one of the questions is always by a prosecutor during jury selection, who's ever had negative police contact.
Yeah.
If you're from a minority community, you've had probably, or they'll say, do you know someone?
Yeah.
Really? So then when you exclude that person, you can't exclude them based upon race, but you can say, well, because I asked them who had negative police contact and they raised their hand or they knew somebody, and they use that as a pretext to eliminate people of color. So that's definitely something that has to change before we really start seeing any kind of changes as far as the system is concerned.
But then that's going to take us to collectively unify and understand the concept of collective univism. See, one of the things we clearly understood in the 60s and why we were so effective was the concept of collective sacrifice, meaning that at the end of the day, we might not personally benefit, but if the community would benefit by our actions, we were mandated to implement those actions. We have got to become far more unified in our thinking process. The municipality, the council persons, the supervisors, they move based on their contingency of their people that they serve. So when you get those structured numbers, and then when you get those same people coming in with strategic plans, strategic solutions to show why a process should be implemented and the results of that process, as opposed to emotionalism, there's nothing wrong with emotionalism, and we need the emotionalism, but at the end of the day, that emotionalism has to be guided by action and achievable methodologies and concepts at the end of the day.
Okay. Well, Doc, like always, I appreciate you coming in and lacing us with that knowledge, because that definitely, that was something that we needed to hear. I appreciate you coming in, and hopefully we'll be able to have some other discussions on this. You got to join us again, because you have a lot of that. So so I want everybody to tune in next week, where we'll be discussing some more critical criminal justice issues. And from myself, Attorney Zulu Ali, and from my Justice Watch crew, Rosa Nunez and Michael Bilal Clark, thank you for joining us for Justice Watch with Attorney Zulu Ali, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.